Well, as Patrick said, we're really delighted to have Bertrand with us today, and having a fantastic pianist, there's only one thing we should really ask, and that's maybe to hear some music. And we're not going to tell you what this is until afterwards, so you can guess while he plays. Well, let's do a bit of detective work. So that was a mazurka, and I think if one looks back and thinks mazurka, there's one name that pops into mind. How, Nigel, did that happen?
Well, Chopin spent most of his adult life in Paris, and Liszt, of course, lived there a long time as well. And I think we hear something very particular in that piece by Saint-Saëns, which is this characteristic that seems to imbue so much French piano music, which is an obsession with clarity on the one hand and sonority and colour and resonance on the other. No matter what the sort of harmonic language, no matter whether we're talking about Saint-Saëns or about, Duthier, there's always this fantastic refined ear for sonority and for the resonance of the instrument, and I think you hear it beautifully even in a little piece like that.
Because Saint-Saëns is one of a composer whose recording we can actually hear him play. I mean, what was he like as a player, judging by...
So you told actually the composer?
Sorry, well, I think Nigel already...
Saint-Saëns.
I told already.
That
you don't have to guess anymore.
That was the third mazurka.
Yeah, absolutely. He was. It's one of the first pianists which was recorded. Actually, probably the people who was. He was born like in
1835.
30, yeah, and so he was already very old when he recorded, almost 80 years old. But what is really interesting is to see his fantastic clarity when he was playing. And I was telling, even first recordings were on piano rolls, and this system is very imprecise in a way, because of course when you put some weight on the key and the roll was sometimes a little bit it kind of overpowers, so it's a little really imbalanced. So if you have little approximations, it will seems to be absolutely huge the result. And with Saint-Saëns, it's the only one I know which, even with the piano roll, is perfectly equal. The control of the sound is so perfect. And I remember an interview of very famous pianist Claudio Arau, which is one of the greatest pianists of the 20th century. And it's kind of unknown interview, but I've read that when he was very, very young, he was studying in Berlin, and one of his more striking memory was a concert of Camille Saint-Saëns when he was a young pianist. So, because we think of him as a composer, but he was a fantastic pianist and also a fantastic organist. Liszt was saying he was the best organist in the world. And this mazurka reminds me actually of Fauré, and Saint-Saëns was the teacher of Fauré, and it's very interesting. I mean, to see this kind of Belle Époque thing. I mean, which you can think of movies by Jean Renoir or things like, or painting by Renoir, or this kind of impressionist thing. I mean, real impressionism actually, because when we talk about impressionism, we think of Debussy, but for me, it's impressionist painting is a little bit more in this kind of perfume and, in a way, light, but also very clear, and with this kind of thing, you have the feeling you have sunny weather you are in a field in the countryside, and with a river around, and but as you said, I mean, it's much more than that, even in a short piece like that.
I mean, when one thinks of the great piano composers, I mean, the first 70 years of the 19th century was very much dominated by Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Poland to an extent, although we could argue that Chopin's moved to France. But people, from Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, right up to Brahms. And then we get the French school, and it's almost in the last years of the 19th century and into the 20th century that the Russians and the French take over. I mean, how did that happen?
Well, we need to nuance it a bit, because
Probably
of course we've got some of the sublimest late 19th century piano music of those wonderful late Brahms pieces. But what's interesting about those is that they start showing an obsession with kind of gorgeous veiled colours and things that we'd not heard even in Brahms before. people like Balakirev were terribly important in bringing Russian music, and of course he was a transcendently wonderful pianist himself as well. And I think it's interesting that in at the French Exposition, the one with the Eiffel Tower in 1889 and the other one 11 years later, there were concerts of Russian music. Rimsky-Korsakov came and conducted some of his pieces and so on. So there was certainly a very nice liaison between the two that developed through actual hearing of the stuff as well. And I think Saint-Saëns surely travelled to Russia fairly often, didn't he, as a pianist?
It's possible. I don't know. He travelled so much. Anyway.
St. Petersburg and places he must have played.
Yeah, absolutely. But you're right. Saying, I mean, at that time, I mean, there are all these kind of national schools where, after this kind of domination by the German music and those composers were following the example of Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, composing, and Schubert, of course, and this kind of sonatas and strong pieces, and suddenly opened this kind of course, from the Russians, the fives, Mussorgsky, Borodin, and Balakirev, especially for the piano. And also Grieg, I mean, was very important coming from Norway, and with this pièce lyrique that Debussy, when he was young, was extremely impressed by this music. I mean, and the French really opened up at that time. It was of course Saint-Saëns, but Chabrier was also somebody who was absolutely really important, because he, in a way, he was also fascinated by Berlioz. I mean, this kind of try to find a way to be completely different from this heavy German heritage. And
what's so interesting about that is that Chabrier and Saint-Saëns and plenty of others were fanatical visitors to Bayreuth practically every year. So they
it was a kind of love and hate relationship.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course,
and Fauré as well.
The French, unlike the Germans, were happy to make fun of Wagner. So you've got the Fauré Messager, Souvenir de Bayreuth, and things like that.
Yeah,
and
of course.
The Chabrier Tristan one, which is wonderful.
Exactly. He wrote that with Messager also, and Fauré, and kind of funny things. But it was really relationship. I mean, even Debussy was a kind of fanatic of Wagner when he was young, and it was like they needed at some point to get rid of this influence, to try to get rid. It's not completely. You feel many things. I mean, the music that it's coming from that, but it was so strong in a way that they could not breathe, and they had to find another way, and that's really what is happening at that time. And especially with Chabrier and Saint-Saëns, for example, but mainly with Chabrier, I would say, and that's what gives us then Debussy and Ravel in a way, in a completely different ways, but especially it explained how Debussy could had the space to give us this incredible freedom that he created.
And actually, while we're talking about these Russian connections as well, it's very interesting at exactly the time that we're talking about, of course. The young Debussy was working for Nadia von Meck as a music teacher to her children in Russia, while Tchaikovsky was spending quite a lot of time living in Paris. So there was quite a regular exchange.
And Tchaikovsky saw one of the first works of Debussy. But he said that it was like, in French they say gentil. It means like it's really like nice, but
nice.
Not very not very offensive.
When we talk, I mean, people quite sloppily put Debussy and Ravel together. They're quite often sort of bracketed together. But apart from the fact that they lived more or less at the same time and they composed a lot for piano, I mean, there's not an enormous amount that links them. I mean, was there influence between the two of them, do you think?
Well, there certainly was a time fairly early on in Ravel's career, because he was that little bit younger, he was 13 years younger, where he certainly was somewhat influenced by Debussy, but I think you're absolutely right. It is very sloppy to just lump them together. I mean, Ravel came at things from a completely different, I would say, from a completely different kind of aesthetic point of view. And certainly in terms of the way that both of them wrote for the piano, both magnificently, but the style of writing is completely different, actually.
Absolutely, it is as different as Chopin and Liszt,
Yeah.
which sometimes people are putting together as well, which is, you cannot imagine something more different. But of course, all those people were knowing themselves quite well. They were interested in their works, and there is something that you can feel. Even Liszt has some Chopin influences sometimes, of course, but it's really too different. I should say, in a way, that Debussy is more coming from a kind of Chopin tradition, and Ravel from a Liszt tradition. I mean, it's very, it's very simple to say that, but let's say, it's absolutely different. I mean, at a certain point, of course, Ravel discovered when he was very young this like everybody. I mean, Debussy was a shock. I mean, at that time, I mean, what he proposed was really something that the way he put the chords together, for example, totally out of the tradition and the traditional rules. I mean that, for example, Saint-Saëns was absolutely shocked by Debussy all the time, all the traditionalists. And
Saint-Saëns was fairly easily shocked, though, wasn't
he? Yeah, of course. And he was apparently kind of a mean person. So,
what sort of influence would the emergent piano, the actual instrument, have had on composition?
I was going to say that the piano and pianists, actually, because one of the things that does actually link Debussy and Ravel, if we're looking for things that they have in common, very often they were being advocated by the same players, and of course composers inevitably write to the strength of players they think are going to be playing their work. So somebody like Ricardo Viñes, Raúl Puño, these wonderful players, Louis Diemer in Saint-Saëns' generation. So I suppose to that extent they may have had in mind particular players. Certainly when Ravel dedicates particular pieces to particular players, you think he maybe has their playing in style in mind.
No, that's true.
No, is it true?
There is yeah, for sure. And the piano playing, I mean, what also is linking those composers, and not only them, I mean, because from that time the relationship to the piano changed completely, I would say with Debussy, but actually it's coming mainly from Liszt. When you hear the Jeu d'eau de la Villa d'Est, for example, it's a mixing between Ravel and Debussy in a way. The piano writing is typical Lisztian, and you can, when you hear Gaspard de la Nuit and those things, you have typically that kind of things. But the harmony are typically Debussist in a way. So it's of course much earlier. I mean, it was composed like I don't know, in the 60s or 70s. So I mean, this is this way to treat the instrument with all the high register, and we should keep in mind that at that time the instrument was really evolving, and it's not the same at all, the same instrument as Beethoven, of course, knew, but even Chopin and Liszt, I mean, lived more than the other romantic composers, and he was already so much demanding to the instrument. When he had this kind of incredible vision of what the piano could maybe give, working even with the first instrument he had in the 30s and the 40s on the extreme register and a very extreme low register, high register, and in order also to produce this kind of overtones thing with the color and working with the pedal. And actually I think we owe Liszt this kind of the piano we have nowadays. I mean, because all his life what he composed was really linked to the evolution of the instrument, and we can say that Steinway, for example, has almost not changed anything from his piano from 1879, and Liszt died in 1886. So that means, I mean, it's just a little bit more powerful. I mean, that it's just about the furniture which are used, but the mechanic of the instrument is exactly the same. Even in the 20th century, it doesn't have changed anything. I mean, we now work on electronic sounds or things, but the instrument in itself is the same. It's really the Lisztian instrument. So all the 20th century's music for the piano actually is coming from there. And I think this way to work on the color, to sometimes use the pedal to mix the sound and to produce those effects with sometimes you can use the high part to produce kind of water-like sound. And Liszt was already using that to describe landscapes, to describe feelings, impressions. I mean, and typical what we call French impressionist things, like about especially the water. I mean, what we find is in his Years of Pilgrimage. And of course, you can definitely find that in Debussy and Ravel's music. And this is the only thing they have in common when you have the cycle of preludes and images from Debussy, and, for example, Ravel composing at the same time the Miroir, for example. But then Ravel is totally evolving in different ways, especially when you think about Le Tombeau de Couperin or Valse Noble and Sentimental. It's really kind of more square and written music in a way. It's that Debussy has this kind of freedom, which is the music in itself is, of course, very much composed, but trying really to be free like a bird, like improvisation, or completely out of any square form. Or, I mean, it's actually much more accurate and precise than what we can think. But the impression is really an impression of incredible freedom.
But we should tell the story of the first performance of the Valse Noble et Sentimentale, because they played a trick on the audience. They played it without saying who the composer was. And they had to guess. And very few of them actually guessed Ravel.
They hated the piece.
They hated the piece.
And they thought it was Satie.
They thought it was Kodai or Satie.
Satie, which is incredible because it's
astonishingly unlike anything Satie did, I know. But I mean, it's a sign of exactly what you're saying about Ravel taking this kind of new pathway that, in 1911 they didn't recognize something that we hear instantly, Ravel, from the first chord,
Yeah, absolutely.
But it was unfamiliar territory that he was going into, and it doesn't, of course, sound remotely Debussy-like. There's a nice other thing to say about that. I think I've got this right. I think it was Louis Aubert who played that premiere, who has the distinction of having given two fantastically important world premieres. He was the boy treble when Fauré's Requiem was first performed, and then he played the world premiere of the Valse Noble. It's pretty good going, isn't it?
I think we've edged very nicely towards another piece of music. Would you, as we've been talking around this, do you want to introduce it?
I will play kind of Debussy's Ravel works. I mean, which is not totally Debussy's, it's typical Ravel. But I mean, this is this kind of impressionist music where their paths cross a little bit. It's a piece called Oiseaux Tristes, Sad Birds, actually, and it comes from the Miroir. And you will hear there is this kind of melody at the beginning, which is actually a bird. It's a song of a bird far away. You can hear in the forest. And Ravel actually used to work in the Fontainebleau forest, and it's apparently some bird that he heard, and he wrote that and composed this magical, melancholic piece around this bird song. So I will play it now.
We started off talking about Saint-Saëns and Fauré, and the interesting thing is that both composers were still composing after Debussy had died and after Ravel had written his last solo piano music. I mean, what sort of happened next, as it were, in the story?
We should say, by the way, it's working. We should say, by the way, that Saint-Saëns was the teacher of Fauré, and Fauré was a teacher of Ravel. It's kind of interesting thing, but please.
Well, I suppose you've got the period sort of from about 1950, the end of the war onwards, really, yes. Well, you get the emergence of Poulenc, who, of course, was a ludicrously talented teenager when the Mouvement Perpétuel, and so he was about 17 when he wrote those. And, of course, one of the great influences on him was Ricardo Viñes, who, of course, had premiered most of the big Debussy and Ravel pieces. So, in other words, you have the beginning of a new generation. You have the other composers that eventually formed Les Six a couple of years later, people like Honegger, people like Mieux. And eventually, in the late 1920s, the arrival on the scene of a strange but ludicrously talented young man in the form of Messiaen with the Preludes, which were his first piano pieces, which he always sort of reluctantly admitted had quite a big Debussy influence, but actually, in terms of sonority, at least as much of a Ravel influence. It seems to me the colours are very more Ravelian than they are Debussy-like, I think. And of course, that's where Messiaen's first bird appeared with La Colombe, the dove, one of the preludes. And there's a very nice link between what Bertrand's just played, of course, and much of Messiaen's slightly later piano music. And obviously his grandest bird work, which is the enormous Catalogue d'Oiseaux from the 1950s. So in other words, you begin to see some sort of, well, it's not exactly a continuum, but you see these things going on in parallel. And you're quite right, there's the fascinating sort of thought of these, well, particularly in the case of Saint-Saëns, these people who were, in terms of their views on music, I mean, fossilized. He thought the end of civilization had arrived when he went to the premiere of Le Sac du Printemps in 1913. He really hated it. Interesting contrast with Puccini, who also was at that premiere, who really loved it. So, but these people were existing at the same time, not necessarily very happily together.
But this period also would have seen the emergence of the pianist as opposed to the composer-pianist, so that there's someone who would play someone else's music.
Yes, so you get the idea of the kind of performer advocate. Yes. I think that's very true. Les Six had their very own favourite pianist, Marcel Mayer, who was a glorious pianist. I think she was a wonderful player, and actually you can almost trace this by seeing what's being dedicated to whom, because vast acres of new music were often being written with the same players in mind. You certainly find that later on as well with pianists like when pianists like the young Yvonne Loriot and her contemporaries, Geneviève Joie, who became Dutier's wife, and so on. So these very talented performers who devoted huge amounts of their energy to advocating one or more composers, whether they were married to them or not.
And Bertrand, I mean, when you're obviously attracted to the music of Olivier Messiaen. I mean,
a lot, yes.
Do you see that just as part of a continuum through French music? Is it a natural step?
Yeah, natural, and I mean, it comes from things which are a little bit different, because Messiaen's music is, first of all, coming from much more from the organ. But the way, I mean, then the way it treats the piano it's a natural step. I mean, it's like you said, it's something like Ravelian, Debussy, but not so much. It's more Ravelian.
Albéniz, who he adored. Albéniz Iberia is a piece that he said when he was writing the Avant-Garde, he said that there were two pieces that had particularly had a huge influence on him. One was Albéniz's great cycle Iberia. The other was Chopin's Barcarolle, with the clap in the right hand.
Absolutely.
These kind of clusters of notes that you get in that extraordinary climax of the Barcarolle. Well, you get it twice. So you're absolutely right. It certainly didn't just come from France in Messiaen's case. And of course, there's also the whole business of Indian rhythm and that sort of thing that he'd learned.
Then absolutely. He added many things. I mean, when he was young, he was an organist and studying with Marcel Dupré, and he studied composition with Paul Dukas, which is a fantastic composer as well. I mean, he has written magnificent pieces for the piano, which are a little bit unknown, but it's really fantastic music as well.
He is one of the few who wrote a gigantic piano sonata, of course.
The sonata, which is dedicated to Saint-Saëns, actually. It's a fantastic piece, absolutely. But Messiaen really came from this tradition where he was at the class, organ class, and improvising and composing in a modal way, which was this word of organist is sometimes completely apart from and so it's a little bit different, of course. And he was extremely Catholic, but really dedicated to that, and so he wrote many pieces about the Jesus Christ and things like that. So it's a little bit different.
Does it feel different under the fingers to play Messiaen's music with its?
Messiaen's music is very specific, especially it does this kind of the first work, like the preludes, are a little bit this kind of organ thing with you play many chords. I mean, like organist, which is very modal chords. I mean, it's very specific. I mean, it's not a real pianistic playing. But then he added all these Lisztian things coming maybe from Chopin as well, but mainly Lisztian treatment of the instrument, especially when he got interested. For example, he was very much interested in Indian rhythms and things like that, like you said, Nigel. And so he used especially the low register to produce like percussion, sound like, and also a lot of the high register, but also parts, especially because of his fascination for birds. I mean, he became then, at the beginning, he was a little bit like the Oiseau Triste. He wrote a little bit La Colombe, things which are bird-like. But then he became kind of specialist, like ornithologist, and he really was precisely recording all
it
the...
It became science, didn't it?
Completely science, and he was writing down songs of the birds of all over the world. I mean, he was absolutely detailed, and also he had these things with the colors. So he was seeing colors with the synesthesie while he was listening to chords, and so it happened to produce a completely unique harmonic word using the overtones and things, which is actually then giving us later what we call in France the spectral music with Gérard Griset and Tristan Murail. But it's really funny because after Debussy and Ravel, so many composers, they tried to compose in that way or to totally bring something new, like this Poulenc and Milhaud at that time, something completely different, and which was in a way everybody at that time trying to search for new ways. They fell down, let's say, but he was sometimes great, into neoclassicism and thought it was the only way. And of course also it was the way to try to escape the domination of serial music in Austria with the Viennese school of Schoenberg and Webern, but and Alban Berg, of course. But Olivier Messiaen, I mean, was completely special case because, of course, he had his own tradition from organist music, something completely apart, and in a way, then he extended that with many personal things. But it's really the piano writing is really in the tradition of Ravel and Liszt in a way.
There's one other very intriguing influence on Messiaen when he was young. The person who taught him music history was a composer called Maurice Emmanuel,
who
course. Wrote some extraordinary piano music, including some sonatinas on Hindu modes.
Yeah, the fifth one.
Yeah, so I mean, there were people experimenting with these sort of elements. Emmanuel's a very interesting composer, actually, and Messiaen often talked about him with a kind of respect that, you know, somebody who's that forgotten, you might not, you know, is not necessarily what you expect. So I think he at least showed Messiaen that it was possible to take these Indian rhythms and modes and do something.
No, it's a
Western
fantastic composer. Actually,
them.
I'm thinking that I should play this sonata because I played that when I was a kid. This is sonata. It's a very good piece, actually. Let me show you a little example of Messiaen's music. I mean, typically you will hear this the left hand. I mean, I don't play the piece, the complete piece, because it's too long. Just the beginning. The left hand is really like this. You can imagine a kind of organ or choir with kind of mystical chords, and you will see the right hand typically is doing this Lisztian bird thing. I just played the beginning. It's one of the pieces from the 20 regards, the 20 regards, which is a fantastic cycle, and this is the 11th piece called Première Communion de la Vierge. Just gonna play the whole piece, but actually I have played the whole cycle, which is like 2 hours length, 10 years ago, and I'm planning to play it, maybe to record.
Is it easy work to? I mean, is it easy work to actually get promoters to take?
It's not easy, but this is a piece composed in the 40s, and now it's almost 80 years old. And for many people, Messiaen, when you talk about Messiaen, it's like contemporary music. I mean, it's already it's okay after Ravel and eventually Stravinsky and not all the works. But if we continue like that, I mean, we have no future in music. So I think I remember I worked quite a lot with Pierre Boulez, and he told me once that, of course, promoters and so on, but the interpreters are not brave enough. And I think it was right. Personally, I'm deeply in love with Messiaen and with many contemporary composers. And I think we need at some point to push a little bit. Because otherwise, if we just think into... it's obvious. I mean, in a way, many people, they like also to go to classical concerts to hear what they already know. And I think there are also many people, and we sometimes we don't think about it, that sometimes like also discovery and like to be surprised, and we should really try more and more, I think, especially when you love it. I have a little bit blocked myself when I was younger because I was thinking, oh no, the people with dislikes of this music. But I think we need to try and to, if we really believe in that, and I think we could transmit something. And so in the case of Messiaen, I think when you hear that nowadays, it doesn't produce, I think, such a... It's like classical music, really. I mean, and it's strange enough that with the 20 Regards, for example, every time when you put the name of Messiaen, people are a little bit reluctant because they think, well, it will be modern music and things like that. But every time I've played this cycle, I can tell the people were in tears after that. I mean, they were completely mesmerized and spellbound. I mean, it was like extremely strong experience. And the same with, especially with the pieces from the 40s. If we think of Turangalli La Symphonie, if we think of the quartet for the end of the time, Vision de la Main for 2 pianos, or the 20 Regards. I mean, this is really music that talks to everybody. I mean, even people that don't know anything about music, haven't heard any classical music before, that it has a very strong impact.
Well, we've sort of reached the end of our journey, but I don't know if anyone would like to ask a question. We can't really see out into the darkness, but... we can. If not, I could see if we could twist your arm, maybe to end with a little encore, perhaps.